Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious how many of you are watching this alone, in the dark, perhaps later than you should be. Tonight, we're stepping into territory that was never meant to be mapped. This is not a simple bestiary, not a parade of fictional creatures. This is a guided descent into the core of a literary phenomenon that dared to ask, what if reality itself was never meant for us? We are about to examine every major entity in the Lovecraftian mythos, from the dream-haunted Cthulhu to the whispering deceptions of Nyarlathotep, from the blind idiot god at the center of all chaos to the final presence, one so conceptually corrosive it has been effectively banned from most discussions of the mythos. Not because it is violent, but because it erases the lines we draw between fiction and implication. This won't be a fan tribute. It's an investigation into the monsters that exist behind, and we'll uncover how this entity, never quite visible, has persisted across literature, games, and even modern occult subcultures. This won't be a story about horror. It's a slow descent into how horror is constructed, linguistically, philosophically, and culturally, when an author pretends to know too much. By the end, you may find that you didn't just learn about Yog-Sothoth. You invited him, simply by listening. The Dunwich Horror emerged in 1928, a period when H.P. Lovecraft was acutely aware that the cultural ground beneath him was shifting. America had entered a post-war modernity marked by accelerating science, rural decline, and the quiet erosion of inherited belief systems. Lovecraft, writing from Providence and reflecting on New England's decaying hinterlands, sensed that old structures, religious, social, epistemic, no longer held unquestioned authority. This story was not written in isolation, but during a phase when Lovecraft actively revised his approach, attempting to make his cosmic ideas more legible without abandoning their philosophical severity. According to his correspondence from late 1927, he explicitly described the Dunwich Horror as an experiment in visible horror, a departure from purely suggestive dread. Consider this carefully. The shift was not toward spectacle, but toward demonstrating consequences. The fictional town of Dunwich draws directly from Lovecraft's observations of rural Massachusetts and Vermont during his travels in the 1920s. These regions, hollowed out by industrial migration, appeared to him as cultural fossils, places where older customs lingered without context. Lovecraft's letters repeatedly describe such towns as anachronisms, geographically American, but temporally stranded. Dunwich becomes a narrative container for these anxieties, a place where modernity never fully arrived, and therefore never fully displaced older fears. This is not merely a backdrop, but a structural necessity. Cosmic horror, as Lovecraft conceives it here, requires isolation, geographic, intellectual, and cultural. Without that isolation, the summoning would lose plausibility. The horror depends on neglect. Lovecraft's creator intent becomes clearer when contrasted with his earlier work. Stories like The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, rely heavily on fragmented documents and global scope, whereas the Dunwich Horror compresses its threat into a single valley and a single family. This was a deliberate recalibration, not an expansion outward, but a tightening inward. By grounding cosmic intrusion in heredity, land ownership, and local rumor, Lovecraft tests whether the incomprehensible can feel immediate. The answer, according to the story's reception, was yes. Yet this immediacy came at a cost. The horror becomes bodily. It inherits social taboos, degeneracy, miscegenation, inherited madness, that reflect Lovecraft's own cultural prejudices. We must pause here. Acknowledging these elements is not an endorsement, but a necessary part of understanding the text's machinery. The Whateley family embodies Lovecraft's fears about knowledge divorced from communal safeguards. Old Whateley is not an occult genius, but a stubborn autodidact, armed with fragments of forbidden texts and no interpretive restraint. This matters. The story does not depict a sophisticated ritualist, but a rural farmer misusing cosmic formulas. Yog-Sothoth is summoned not through mastery, but through misapplication, not reverence, but desperation. This distinction is critical. Lovecraft frames cosmic catastrophe as the result of partial understanding, knowledge accessed without context, tradition, or ethical boundary. In this sense, the story mirrors contemporary anxieties about science, advancing faster than moral frameworks, a concern widely discussed in the aftermath of World War I. Scholars often note that the Dunwich Horror coincides with Lovecraft's growing fascination with pseudo-academic framing. Dr. Armitage, introduced here as a stabilizing force, represents institutional knowledge attempting to contain what folk curiosity unleashed. The conflict is not between belief and disbelief, but between unsupervised inquiry and disciplined scholarship. This is not magic versus science, but reckless curiosity versus controlled interpretation. A useful comparison can be drawn to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, another narrative where creation outpaces responsibility. Yet Lovecraft's innovation lies in removing moral redemption. There is no remorseful creator, only aftermath and containment. It is also essential to situate the Dunwich Horror within Lovecraft's broader philosophical pessimism. By 1928, his materialism had hardened. He no longer viewed the universe as indifferent, but as actively hostile to human meaning. Yog-Sothoth functions as a conceptual shorthand for this hostility. Not evil, but incompatible. Not a god in any theological sense, but a structural feature of reality that renders human frameworks provisional. The summoning, therefore, is not a blasphemous act, but a category error. Humans mistake access for control. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's intent. The horror is not that Yog-Sothoth answers, but that it always already exists. To understand Yog-Sothoth's conceptual density, one must look far beyond Lovecraft himself. While the Dunwich Horror is a modern text, its scaffolding is ancient. The notion of a being that is both omniscient and incomprehensible did not begin in the Miskatonic Valley. It echoes across millennia, in Gnostic cosmologies, pre-Socratic paradoxes, medieval grimoires, and 19th century occult revivals. Yog-Sothoth is not Lovecraft's invention in the strict sense, but his synthesis. He fuses threads from myth, mysticism, and materialism into a figure that can only be gestured toward, never fully described. The closest philosophical precedent lies in Gnostic dualism, particularly the notion of a pleroma, a divine fullness existing beyond the material world. In some Gnostic systems, intermediary beings called aeons act as flawed bridges between human perception and divine truth. Yog-Sothoth, described as the key and the gate, plays a similar role. It is not God nor devil, but a metaphysical interface. The summoning, then, is not religious in the conventional sense, but ontological, a violent opening between levels of reality that were never meant to meet. Consider this carefully. Such figures were not meant to be worshipped, but survived. A second lineage comes from Kabbalistic cosmology, specifically the idea of the Ein Sof, the infinite, unknowable source of all things, manifesting in 10 emanations, or sephirot. The idea that ultimate reality is layered, distorted through proximity, and accessible only through dangerous symbolic structures echoes throughout the Dunwich Horror. Yog-Sothoth does not descend into the world. It must be aligned with. This mirrors esoteric traditions where invocation is less about summoning and more about synchronization. The Whateleys' rituals are not coercive, but attunement-based, if clumsily executed. We must also consider the philosophical shift of the late 19th century, when scientific determinism collided with existential doubt. Thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, and later Martin Heidegger began to question the comprehensibility of the universe itself. The idea that meaning is not discovered but imposed, that knowledge reveals only deeper ignorance, deeply informs Lovecraft's mythos. Yog-Sothoth is not the endpoint of inquiry. It is what emerges when inquiry itself becomes pathological. It is the epistemological singularity where further pursuit collapses the mind that seeks it. In parallel, occult revival movements in the late 1800s, particularly Theosophy, founded by Helena Blavatsky, introduced Western readers to syncretic blends of Hindu, cosmology, Egyptian mysticism, and Eastern metaphysics. The theosophical idea of ascending planes of existence, inhabited by beings from higher spiritual orders, closely resembles Lovecraft's layered cosmology. But where Theosophy offered transcendence, Lovecraft offered violation, not ascension, but rupture. The Whateleys seek higher contact and receive only fragmentation. Yog-Sothoth's visual ambiguity also reflects Platonic metaphysics, in which the highest truths exist beyond form, accessible only through abstraction. The idea of a being whose presence shatters perception and whose form cannot be held mirrors Plato's idea of the form of the good, but inverted. Instead of truth drawing the soul upward, Yog-Sothoth is an anti-form, a conceptual collapse that overwhelms rather than enlightens. Its knowledge is total but non-human. That which sees all sees nothing we recognize. There are also more immediate cultural sources to consider. New England folk religion, with its mixture of Puritan theology, backwoods superstition, and suppressed native beliefs, haunts the Dunwich Horror. Lovecraft's landscape is populated not just by monsters, but by memory. Memory of the Salem witch trials, of curses that last generations, of unspoken pacts and buried transgressions. Yog-Sothoth becomes, in this context, a mythologized consequence. It is not a cause, but an answer to guilt, to abandonment, to knowledge left to rot in isolation. A particularly American influence is transcendentalism, especially its darker inheritors like Nathaniel Hawthorne. While Emerson and Thoreau saw nature as divine, Hawthorne saw it as morally ambiguous and deeply haunted. Lovecraft adopts this latter view. The Whateleys are not natural aberrations. They are products of a forgotten pact with the natural world's other side. The hills of Dunwich do not merely echo, they remember. They call back. Finally, we must acknowledge the Darwinian shadow under which Lovecraft wrote. Evolutionary theory dismantled humanity's exceptionalism. If life was a chemical accident and consciousness a biological anomaly, then what else might be out there? More evolved, more ancient, more indifferent. Yog-Sothoth emerges at the intersection of Darwin and dread. It is not evil. It is merely more real than we can tolerate. Names in Lovecraft are never arbitrary. They are doors, some ajar, some nailed shut, others opening only inward. Yog-Sothoth, among the most linguistically arresting of Lovecraft's invented names, functions not as a descriptor, but as a signal of destabilization. It defies familiarity. Its cadence is unnatural. Its etymology is deliberately obscure. And that, precisely, is the point. The name Yog-Sothoth resists linguistic mapping. It appears to follow no clear syntactic logic from any single language, yet it hints at multiple traditions. The syllables Yog and Sothoth carry a kind of pseudo-Semitic resonance, evoking the guttural and the sacred. Lovecraft often drew upon Arabic, Hebrew, and other Semitic-sounding phonemes to lend a mythic and archaic weight to his creations. He called this aesthetic arabesque, drawing inspiration from texts like the 1001 Nights, and especially from his own fictional Necronomicon, supposedly written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. The purpose was not to mimic any real language, but to gesture toward linguistic distance, toward something once spoken and since forgotten or forbidden. This naming strategy functions symbolically. Yog-Sothoth is not a name to be understood. It is a name to be pronounced incorrectly. Its power lies in the alien mouthfeel, the way it stumbles across the tongue, echoing rituals that were never meant for human vocal cords. The Whateley's incantations, when rendered in English transcription, carry none of the clarity one might expect from a traditional invocation. Instead, they sound like broken echoes. Ya-ang-ing-ah, Yog-Sothoth, he, lgb, fi-I, throdog, yu-achi. These syllables are not meant to be deciphered. They are meant to be survived. Symbolically, this kind of language invokes the apophatic tradition, a form of theology in which the divine can only be described by what it is not. Like the unknowable Ein Sof of Kabbalah, or the via negativa of Christian mysticism, Yog-Sothoth cannot be approached directly through language. It must be circled, hinted at, veiled. The ritual phrases in the Dunwich Horror do not clarify. They erode understanding. They are not keys to knowledge. They are corrosion. We must pause here to observe that Lovecraft's mythos is not a coherent cosmology. It is an anti-cosmology. Terms like the key, the gate, and the guardian of the gate suggest roles, but never resolve into identity. Yog-Sothoth is not a god, nor a place, nor an event, but somehow all three. This triadic ambiguity is crucial. It mimics the rhetorical structure of ancient, religious formulae. The way, the truth, and the life becomes the gate, the key, the guardian. The echo is intentional, but here, the familiarity is hollowed out. The structure remains. The certainty does not. Lovecraft's symbolic language also disrupts temporal logic. Phrases like Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate collapse distinction between roles, between time, between action, and being. This grammatical instability reflects the thematic instability of the story. The Whateley's incantations seek not to call Yog-Sothoth into time, but to break time open. Language here becomes a lever to violate causality. The ritual language of the Dunwich Horror also reflects a broader literary tradition of magical grimoires, texts where incantations are written in fragmented, often nonsensical language, mixing Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and fictional terms. Lovecraft's invented tomes, the Necronomicon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, Cults des Ghoul, continue this pattern. These books are not meant to be read. They are meant to be possessed. Their language functions like a curse. Ownership itself becomes contamination. Wilbur Whateley's obsessive need to access the complete Necronomicon mirrors this symbolic economy. The knowledge is not additive, it is subtractive. Each phrase read erodes the boundary between human and cosmic grammar. we must also consider the written language within the text itself, Wilbur's diary. It is written in curious hybrid jargon, blending English, Latin, and what Armitage calls unknown ideographic symbols. The diary becomes a textual double of the summoning ritual, a document that is half language, half signal. It embodies what philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein would call the limits of language. Whereof one cannot speak, one must write erratically. And yet there is one recurring phrase that seems to carry meaning across all these contexts. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. This repetition operates as a mantra, but also as an ontological paradox. A gate implies transition, but Yog-Sothoth is not a facilitator. It is the transition. It exists as the condition for boundaries to be crossed, which makes it both present and absent in any act of summoning. Not a being summoned, but the act of summoning made sentient. This is the essence of Lovecraftian language, the suggestion that even our grammar conspires against comprehension. In summoning Yog-Sothoth, one does not speak it into existence. One speaks into its presence. The moment you name it, you are already too late. Lovecraft did not merely write stories. He constructed myths, but not in the way classical authors did. His myths do not arise from collective belief over generations. Instead, they are carefully engineered to feel ancient, to carry the illusion of long-standing authenticity, even as they are entirely synthetic. The Dunwich Horror is a prime example of this strategy. The story succeeds not because it convinces readers of Yog-Sothoth's literal existence, but because it mimics the texture of forgotten lore. Its impact lies in the creeping suspicion that what we're reading may not be fiction after all, but recovered testimony. This myth-building begins with the use of fabricated scholarly apparatus. Lovecraft frequently inserts invented books, false citations, and fictional academics, none more prominent than the dreaded Necronomicon, referenced liberally throughout the Dunwich Horror. But he does not present the Necronomicon as a magical object in the fantasy sense. Instead, it behaves like a grim medieval theological treatise, dense, referential, and inaccessible without academic mediation. When Dr. Armitage consults it, the text becomes a kind of epistemic gateway, mirroring Yog-Sothoth's role. The book is not powerful because it contains spells. It is powerful because it carries authority. It feels like a forbidden relic from a parallel intellectual tradition. This is deliberate. Lovecraft crafts not a mythology of gods, but a mythology of scholarly panic. The effect is intensified through the narrative framing device. The events of the Dunwich Horror are presented not as direct experience, but as historical reconstruction. The tale is told in retrospective, as though the facts have been compiled from local testimonies, library records, and university archives. This creates the illusion of distance, the signature move of myth. Myths are rarely experienced firsthand. They are discovered, retold, pieced together. Lovecraft constructs a synthetic archive within the story itself, and in doing so, he allows Yog-Sothoth to inhabit not the world, but the record of the world. The town of Dunwich furthers this strategy. It is entirely fictional, yet rendered with the specificity of a real place. Its hills, bridges, decaying farms, and local customs are described with documentary precision. There are family, lineages, civic tensions, and whispered superstitions that suggest a fully formed sociological system. And within that system, the Whateleys emerge not as monsters, but as products. Their abnormalities are explained not through exposition, but through rumor, dialect, and inference. This mimics the way real-world folklore accumulates, through hearsay that hardens into communal memory. Lovecraft is not describing Dunwich. He is imitating how Dunwich might be remembered. We must pause here and consider a vital narrative tactic: the gradation of belief. At no point are we asked to believe the Whateleys outright. Instead, Lovecraft structures the story so that the villagers' disbelief gradually erodes. The horror escalates not from spectacle, but from accumulated plausibility. First, the abnormal growth of Wilbur. Then, the eerie animal behavior. Then, the unexplained disappearances. By the time the invisible twin is rampaging across the hills, we've already been conditioned to expect something worse. The horror is not just that the ritual worked, it's that we suspected it would. A comparison is useful here. In ancient myth, such as that of Oedipus, revelation arrives as the inevitable result of prophecy fulfilled. In Lovecraft's myth-building, revelation arrives as the realization that prophecy was never metaphorical. The phrases chanted by the Whateleys were not symbolic. They were instructions. The invisible brother was not a metaphor for sin. He was a literal offspring. The horror is not the twist. It is the retroactive clarity. Further, Lovecraft borrows the structural scaffolding of biblical and folkloric storytelling. The use of triadic naming, the key, the gate, the guardian, the presence of a lone scholar confronting evil, Armitage as Moses-like figure, and the suggestion of a cosmic covenant violated, the Whateleys meddling with ancestral forces, all evoke a deep mythic rhythm. But in Lovecraft's world, redemption is absent. Armitage halts, the immediate threat, but the underlying cosmic imbalance remains unresolved. This too is mythic, the feeling that what was interrupted will return. Finally, Lovecraft's myth-making achieves authenticity by avoiding finality. Yog-Sothoth is not defeated. It is not even fully contacted. What we witness is a failed summoning, and yet even that failure destabilizes the world. The narrative leaves open the possibility that another attempt may succeed, that another family in another hidden valley may try again. Mythology, after all, is recursive. It doesn't end. It returns in different forms, under different names. To summon Yog-Sothoth is not to invite a god, but to rupture the scaffolding of human understanding. In Lovecraft's philosophical framework, entities like Yog-Sothoth are not characters in a mythos. They are conceptual weapons. Each one dismantles a foundational assumption of human reality. In the Dunwich Horror, the very notion of causality, individuality, and spatial integrity begins to fray. The true horror lies not in what Yog-Sothoth does, but in what its implied existence reveals. That reality may not have been made with us in mind. Three core philosophical tensions define Lovecraft's portrayal of Yog-Sothoth: cosmic insignificance, entropic dissolution, and the dreamlike unreliability of perception. Each interacts with the others in recursive loops, dissolving any clear boundary between mind and world, between reality and ritual. First, there is the concept of cosmic insignificance. This idea, more than any particular creature or event, underpins Lovecraft's horror. In the presence of Yog-Sothoth, humans are not merely small, they are irrelevant. Lovecraft's materialism, sharpened by the scientific revolutions of the 19th century, casts humanity as a biological accident, adrift in a universe governed by forces indifferent to consciousness. Yog-Sothoth, described as existing outside time and space, is not a threat because it chooses to harm, but because harm is an incidental byproduct of its structural existence. Summoning it is akin to opening a pressurized vault. Catastrophe is not malevolent, it is mathematical. This idea draws heavily from post-Darwinian pessimism. Just as Darwin displaced humanity from the center of creation, Yog-Sothoth displaces consciousness from the center of meaning. If this being is the key and the gate, then the universe itself is constructed on principles that precede and possibly exclude human thought. The Whateleys, in summoning it, do not breach a sacred boundary. They confirm that no such boundary ever existed. This is not transgression, but exposure. Secondly, Lovecraft ties Yog-Sothoth to entropy, not in the thermodynamic sense, but as a metaphysical condition. Entropy here functions as the slow, inevitable unraveling of coherence. The events of the Dunwich Horror depict a world fraying at the edges. Language breaks down, animal behavior destabilizes. Physical laws no longer apply with uniformity. The invisible twins' rampage is not just destructive, it is entropically revealing. It demonstrates that coherence was always provisional, that stability was a local anomaly. Consider the line, Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Gates imply passage, but also containment. To open such a gate is to release something, but also to realize the gate was never sealed. In this way, Yog-Sothoth embodies the entropic return of the universe to its underlying chaos. Wilbur's accelerated growth, the corruption of space on the farmhouse hill, and the blending of dimensions all reflect a movement toward collapse. The Whateleys don't cause decay, they accelerate it. The third and most disturbing idea is dream reality instability. Lovecraft's fiction often traffics in the tension between what is seen and what is real. But in the case of Yog-Sothoth, that tension becomes structural. If this being exists outside time, then perception itself becomes suspect. Dreams are not merely metaphors, they are ontological leakage. In the Dunwich Horror, much of the townspeople's terror arises not from what they witness, but from what they suspect they might have seen. Strange sounds, shifting shadows, recurring dreams of hills rumbling. These are not narrative flourishes, they are philosophical provocations. Is perception a guide or a filter? And what happens when the filter tears? This ties directly to the idea of epistemic rupture. Yog-Sothoth is not terrifying because it destroys the body. It destroys the framework by which the body knows it exists. Armitage and his fellow scholars barely succeed in identifying the threat, and only by reconstructing its shape from incomplete linguistic, spatial, and textual clues. This is no accident. The story is structured like a failed epistemology, partial data, corrupted records, ambiguous signs. The character's victory is temporary and conditional. The horror is paused, not resolved. We must pause here to consider the triadic formulation that Lovecraft often repeats. Yog-Sothoth is the gate, the key, the guardian. This construction is not ornamental. It serves a disintegrative function. It collapses categories. Agent, action, and barrier become indistinct. This mirrors Hegel's dialectic of the absolute, except Lovecraft inverts it. Where Hegel moves toward synthesis, Lovecraft collapses into incoherence. The phrase is not enlightenment, it is overload. And therein lies the deeper philosophical function of Yog-Sothoth. It is not a character, but a paradox given flesh. It is the anti-symbol, the being that reveals the futility of beings. The Whateleys' attempt to engage it is a form of suicide by ontology. They seek knowledge so pure it unmakes the knower. That they partially succeed is not triumph. It is warning. Yog-Sothoth is never truly alone. In the Dunwich Horror, its presence is mediated, manifested, and echoed through other beings. Chief among them, Wilbur Whateley and his monstrous unseen twin. These figures are not simple agents of a higher power. They are derivatives, ontological echoes of Yog-Sothoth's logic. In Lovecraft's cosmology, entities rarely exist in isolation. They ripple, they seep, they spawn. To summon Yog-Sothoth is not to bring forth a god, but to awaken a system, a network of interlinked violations that dismantle reality by degrees. Wilbur Whateley, outwardly human in form but grotesque in proportion and development, is the first and most visible manifestation. He is born of a human mother, Lavinia Whateley, and an unseen cosmic father, presumed to be Yog-Sothoth. Yet Wilbur is not merely a hybrid, he is a failed conduit. His accelerated growth, prodigious learning, and increasing desperation to access the unabridged Necronomicon all point to a being who was designed, not to live, but to unlock. His purpose is instrumental. He is a biological ritual. Lovecraft signals this through Wilbur's bodily horror. His anatomy is described not as malformed, but as incorrect, as though sculpted from the wrong cosmological assumptions. His physical body defies evolutionary precedent. His goatish features, his ambiguous sexuality, his inhuman resilience to pain. These traits don't serve a symbolic function. They are proofs, evidence that Yog-Sothoth's logic has touched the genetic code. Wilbur is not an emissary of a god. He is the biological byproduct of a misaligned equation. But it is Wilbur's twin, the invisible brother, who embodies Yog-Sothoth more completely. This second being, never fully seen and only imperfectly heard, represents a purer instantiation of the cosmic parent. Unlike Wilbur, who navigates the world through mimicry and deception, the twin exists as rupture. He is pure effect. His invisibility is not a magical trick. It is a metaphysical statement. The human nervous system cannot resolve his form, not because he is hidden, but because he is incorrectly dimensioned. He is not unseen. He is unseeable. The twins' communication, groaning, rhythmic pounding, the occasional utterance in warped English, reveals that he is not mindless. He is aware, suffering, and bound. But his awareness is filtered through a syntax that barely accommodates the human. When he finally speaks intelligibly, calling out for his fatter, he collapses the distance between Lovecraft's cosmic horror and tragic pathos. He is a child in search of origin, a theological accident begging for explanation. This invocation of Yog-Sothoth through hybrid offspring recalls ancient mythic structures. Consider the Nephilim of Hebrew Apocrypha, giant children born of divine and human unions, condemned to destruction. Or the Titans of Greek mythology, primal beings born of sky and earth, trapped between gods and mortals. Yet Lovecraft reverses the pattern. These children are not punished by jealous gods. They are ignored by an indifferent one. Yog-Sothoth offers no guidance, no intervention. The twins' rampage is not divine judgment. It is orphaned existence, powerful, misdirected, and ultimately doomed. Beyond the Whateleys, we find other forces subtly arrayed. Dr. Armitage and the Miskatonic scholars serve as symbolic counterweights, not because they wield power, but because they represent containment. Their knowledge is institutional, fragmented, and always reactive. They do not defeat Yog-Sothoth. They merely interrupt its manifestation. This is a key feature of Lovecraftian cosmology. Good and evil are irrelevant categories. What matters is scale. Armitage acts within a human scale. Yog-Sothoth does not. Consider the symbolic geography of the story. The Whateley farmhouse sits on a hill, elevated yet isolated, suggesting a locus where dimensions thin. The landscape around it begins to deform. Crops grow monstrously large. Sounds echo incorrectly. and animals behave as though spatially confused. These are not localized hauntings. They are spatial symptoms. Lovecraft implies that the twins' presence, and by extension Yog-Sothoth's influence, is not contained within a body, but radiates outward, warping everything it touches. It is tempting to view these entities as discrete figures, but doing so misses Lovecraft's deeper point. Yog-Sothoth does not appear in this story, yet its presence is total. It saturates the logic of events. It expresses itself through mutation, erasure, and confusion. Its offspring are not characters in the conventional sense. They are errors in the human operating system. Wilbur and his brother are not villains. They are side effects. We must not forget Lavinia Whateley, the human mother whose role is often reduced to mere vessel. Her fate, mysteriously vanishing, possibly consumed, is itself a kind of offering, not to Yog-Sothoth, but to the narrative's symbolic economy. She embodies the cost of cosmic contact. Her body enables the story, but her agency is erased. In Lovecraft's universe, women are often portrayed not as individuals, but as thresholds, portals through which the human yields to the inhuman. In Lovecraft's universe, madness is not a psychological malfunction. It is a diagnostic outcome. When humans encounter Yog-Sothoth, or even its indirect consequences, the resulting mental collapse is not portrayed as hysteria or delusion, but as the mind responding correctly to incompatible information. The Dunwich Horror frames madness as the price of partial comprehension, the inevitable consequence of cognition exceeding its design limits. This distinction is crucial. Lovecraft does not depict insanity as loss of reason, but as surplus reason. Characters unravel not because they abandon logic, but because logic leads them somewhere the human nervous system cannot sustain. Yog-Sothoth does not attack the mind. It renders the mind obsolete. Consider this carefully. What appears as madness to the outside observer may, within Lovecraft's framework, be a form of catastrophic clarity. The Whateleys provide the primary case study. Old Whateley is not insane in the conventional sense. He is methodical, focused, and obsessive, but not incoherent. His journals and ritual preparations demonstrate planning, pattern recognition, and long-term strategy. His madness lies not in confusion, but in fixation. He mistakes access for understanding. His mental collapse arrives only after the ritual's consequences exceed even his expectations. When he dies, it is not screaming in terror, but muttering formulas he no longer fully controls. Knowledge has outpaced its interpreter. Wilbur's mental state is more complex. He is born already misaligned with human cognition. His precocious intellect, rapid literacy, and alien mannerisms suggest a mind tuned to frequencies others cannot perceive. Yet Wilbur is not enlightened. He is anxious, driven, and perpetually frustrated. His desperation to consult the complete Necronomicon reveals the central paradox of Lovecraftian madness, knowing that something exists, but not knowing enough. Wilbur's mind strains against a ceiling it can sense, but never breach. His madness is anticipatory, a tension between what he almost understands and what he never will. Lavinia Whateley's condition introduces another dimension. Described as feeble-minded by the townsfolk, her mental state is left deliberately vague. She hears voices, she wanders, she vanishes. Lovecraft's language here reflects early 20th century psychiatric prejudices, but within the narrative, her sensitivity may signal not deficiency, but permeability. She perceives what others cannot. This is not empowerment, it is exposure. Her madness functions as vulnerability, making her a conduit rather than an agent. In Lovecraft's symbolic economy, sensitivity is not a gift, it is an invitation. Beyond the Whateleys, the townspeople of Dunwich exhibit a more diffuse psychological response. They experience unease, dread, and avoidance long before any visible catastrophe occurs. Animals panic. Children refuse to approach certain hills. These reactions are not framed as superstition, but as inherited intuition. The community's collective psyche registers disturbance before it can articulate cause. This aligns with anthropological theories of cultural memory, where societies encode danger through taboo and folklore, rather than explicit knowledge. Dunwich knows something is wrong without knowing what. That gap between sensation and explanation is where Lovecraft locates horror. Dr. Armitage's interaction with madness is markedly different. As a scholar, he approaches Yog-Sothoth through mediation, texts, translations, controlled inference. His mind bends but does not break. Yet this resilience is conditional. Armitage survives because he stops short. He reads enough to act, but not enough to understand. This is not courage, but restraint. His sanity is preserved through limitation. He does not seek truth. He seeks containment. In Lovecraft's universe, this is the highest form of wisdom available to humans. We must pause here to distinguish Lovecraftian madness from moral failing. It is not punishment. It is consequence. Not corruption, but incompatibility. Yog-Sothoth does not drive humans mad intentionally. Madness occurs because the human mind evolved to model a narrow slice of reality. When confronted with structures beyond that slice, non-linear time, non-Euclidean space, consciousness without subject, the mind produces symptoms analogous to system failure. Hallucinations, paranoia, and dissociation are not errors. They are emergency protocols. A comparison clarifies this. In traditional religious narratives, divine revelation overwhelms, but ultimately redeems. Moses descends from the mountain transformed. Paul converts on the road to Damascus. In Lovecraft's framework, revelation offers no redemption, only damage. Knowledge does not elevate, it destabilizes. Not enlightenment, but collapse. Yog-Sothoth does not reveal truth. It reveals the absence of a truth humans can use. This brings us to the function of madness within the story's structure. Madness acts as both warning and proof. It signals that a boundary has been crossed. It confirms that something real, not imagined, has occurred. In this sense, insanity becomes evidence. When multiple characters independently deteriorate in similar ways, the narrative suggests causality. The horror is validated through psychological pattern, not visual confirmation. Ultimately, human interaction with Yog-Sothoth demonstrates the impossibility of neutral contact. One cannot observe without being altered. One cannot know without cost. Madness is not the failure of the individual. It is the failure of the species to accommodate a universe that was never designed to be understood. In the Dunwich Horror, knowledge is not neutral. It is corrosive. To seek understanding is to risk unmaking the very mind that pursues it. This reversal, where knowledge does not enlighten but annihilates, lies at the heart of Lovecraft's horror, and nowhere is it more sharply embodied than in the concept of forbidden knowledge. This is not information guarded for ethical or legal reasons. It is knowledge that undoes the knower. Lovecraft introduces this idea with a subtle inversion. The Necronomicon, the central grimoire of the mythos, is a book of cosmological facts, not spells. Its danger lies not in incantation, but in implication. It reveals things that are true and that should never be known. Dr. Armitage's caution and Wilbur Whateley's obsession provide two poles of interaction with this knowledge. One retreats before the final page, the other dies reaching for it. Neither approach is victorious. Both confirm that reading in this universe is a summoning act. Wilbur's desire for the complete Necronomicon is not driven by curiosity, but by necessity. His twin's growth cannot be completed without the information it contains. But crucially, Wilbur does not understand what he reads. He imitates, deciphers, extrapolates, but he does not comprehend. This is the essence of Lovecraftian epistemology. Information exceeds context. The human brain evolved to parse linear events, visible objects, and localized space. The Necronomicon offers none of these. Its truths span dimensions, collapse causality, and reverse subject-object relations. What Wilbur confronts is not mystery, but anti-coherence. This leads us to the core idea: epistemic collapse. When knowledge is no longer organized in categories, the human mind can navigate cause and effect, before and after, self and other. Then knowing becomes indistinguishable from disintegration. Lovecraft's characters don't go mad because they discover secrets. They go mad because the form of knowledge itself breaks. The sentence ceases to serve. The diagram curves into contradiction. The ritual merges noun and verb until both dissolve. Lovecraft mimics this effect through language. The phrases used in Whateley rituals are not syntactically consistent. Their grammar is corrupted. Alien sounds interrupt human syntax. Latin merges with inarticulate growls. This is not a literary flourish. It's a model of what epistemic collapse feels like. The moment understanding is attempted, structure disintegrates. This is also mirrored in Wilbur's diary, described as a curiously hybrid jargon. Language becomes half symbol, half noise. Not meaningless, but excessively meaningful, beyond what a single semantic system can contain. We must pause here and acknowledge a philosophical precedent. Immanuel Kant argued that space and time are not properties of the universe, but structures imposed by the mind to make sense of experience. Lovecraft, writing a century later, takes this further. If the structures of the mind are not hardwired into the cosmos, then some knowledge, particularly that which comes from outside time, is structurally untranslatable. Yog-Sothoth, existing at all times and all places, breaks this mental architecture. The knowledge it offers cannot be mapped onto our temporal grammar. What results is not error, but recursive unknowing. This is why the act of summoning Yog-Sothoth is indistinguishable from reading about it. The Necronomicon does not contain rituals in the Harry Potter sense. It is the ritual. To read it is to align one's cognitive architecture with a being that does not obey causal sequencing. This is not metaphor. It is metaphysical assertion. The book is not a conduit. It is a transformation device, one that operates on the reader's epistemic boundaries. Armitage, in contrast to Wilbur, represents a different engagement with forbidden knowledge. Containment through partiality. He reads, but only selectively. He understands, but only to the point of intervention. He knows that to seek full comprehension is to risk becoming part of the mythos. His victory at the end of the Dunwich Horror is not total. It is provisional. He halts the eruption, but cannot repair the boundary. The knowledge remains. The gate remains ajar. This tension between containment and contagion reflects modern anxieties about information. In an era defined by rapid technological acceleration, Lovecraft anticipates a world in which not all data should be downloaded. His horror is not that there is too little to know, but but that there is too much. And some of it destabilizes the conditions of knowing itself. A comparison is instructive here. In Goethe's Faust, forbidden knowledge is exchanged for power. In Lovecraft, there is no exchange, only erosion. The more one knows, the less one remains. The Whateleys are not corrupted by evil. They are subtracted by truth, and that ultimately is the warning embedded in the Dunwich Horror. Not that there are secrets best left alone, but that understanding. Them may require becoming something else entirely, a vessel, a gate, a reflection. Yog-Sothoth did not erupt fully formed into Lovecraft's mythos. Its presence, like its nature, was cumulative, whispered before it was named, implied before it was described. Understanding the entity's earliest appearances reveals how Lovecraft built an intertextual cosmology, a universe whose horror emerges not from any single tale, but from the recursive gravity between them. In this literary structure, Yog-Sothoth functions less as a character and more as a thematic convergence point, a conceptual force that migrates across texts and destabilizes them from within. The first mention of Yog-Sothoth appears in the Case of Charles Dexter Ward, written in 1927, published posthumously in 1941. There, the name surfaces in a fragmentary incantation. Yainga Yog-Sothoth, he legeb fei throwdog ua. The passage is untranslated, uncontextualized, and deliberately alien. It does not explain the entity, nor hint at its function. This is the point. The phrase's purpose is not informational, but tonal. It gestures towards something ancient and inhuman, suggesting that even the language used to describe such a being must remain unresolved. Yog-Sothoth enters Lovecraft's mythos not through exposition, but through ritual noise, a declaration that some names are not to be understood, only survived. Its next significant appearance comes in The Horror in the Museum, 1932, ghost written by Lovecraft for Hazel Heald. Here, Yog-Sothoth is named among a list of other cosmic entities, including Nyarlathotep and Shub-Niggurath. Still, no clear definition emerges. Instead, the reference operates within a larger system of illusions, an esoteric catalog that implies vast and intersecting theologies. The cumulative effect is one of overwhelming density. These entities seem to belong to a forgotten pantheon, whose rituals, hierarchies, and cosmological functions elude modern comprehension. By refusing to clarify, Lovecraft sharpens their impact. The reader, like the character, is left grasping. But it is in the Dunwich Horror, 1929, where Yog-Sothoth takes literary form, not through physical presence, but through implication. The being is not summoned onto the stage, but inferred through the consequences of its summoning. This is the first story where Yog-Sothoth is directly linked to biological offspring, marking a significant shift in Lovecraft's conception of cosmic horror. Previously, the mythos emphasized spatial or temporal disruption. Here, the horror becomes generative. Yog-Sothoth does not merely alter space, it enters the genetic code. Wilbur Whateley and his twin are not avatars, they are expressions. This innovation reverberates throughout Lovecraft's later stories. In Through the Gates of the Silver Key, 1934, Yog-Sothoth becomes a metaphysical framework, a being that exists across all time and space, capable of collapsing identity and subjectivity into a non-linear continuum. There, Randolph Carter's soul is absorbed into a larger cosmic intelligence, suggesting that Yog-Sothoth is not merely a godlike entity, but a cosmic topology, the structure upon which all being is mapped. The reader is invited to consider Yog-Sothoth as a metaphor for ontological instability. Identity becomes multiplicity, and selfhood dissolves into co-experienced probability. These texts form a recursive system. The Dunwich Horror grounds Yog-Sothoth in the biological and ritualistic. Silver Key abstracts it into philosophical metaphysics. Earlier references, like those in Charles Dexter Ward, now gain retroactive meaning. Each text reframes the others, creating what literary theorists might call a hypertextual web. A mythos where the value of each appearance lies in its cumulative distortion, not clarification. This technique borrows heavily from the structure of religious apocrypha, where different texts present conflicting accounts of divine figures. Like early Christian Gnostic writings or heterodox Islamic traditions, Lovecraft's mythos refuses systematization. Yog-Sothoth is at once key, gate, guardian, father, being, process, place, and principle. The contradictions are deliberate. They simulate the breakdown of theological taxonomy when confronted with the truly alien. Notably, Lovecraft's reuse of names and entities across stories creates lateral continuity. Characters like Randolph Carter and references to the Necronomicon, Miskatonic University, or Arkham provide grounding, but only superficially. These narrative constants serve as anchors, while the forces they attempt to describe shift with each iteration. Yog-Sothoth's meaning is never stable. It accumulates resonance, not definition. This intertextual strategy enables Lovecraft to construct a mythos that resists closure. Each story gestures beyond itself, inviting the reader to assemble fragments, only to find that assembly impossible. The horror lies not in the unknowable, but in the partially known, in the cognitive dissonance that results when familiar narrative devices, protagonists, scholars, explanations, fail to restore order. Lovecraft replaces plot with suggestive recursion, a narrative technique where meaning is not clarified through repetition, but eroded. We must conclude this section with a reminder. Yog-Sothoth's earliest appearances do not build toward revelation, but toward disintegration of expectation. There is no climactic unveiling. Instead, the entity becomes more disturbing as it becomes more central. Its true function is not narrative, but ontological. It exists to challenge the very medium of fiction, to suggest that some stories, once begun, can never be fully told. The Dunwich Horror is not a story about Yog-Sothoth's appearance. It is a story about what happens when someone tries to bring it into the world and fails only partially. This distinction is critical. The horror of the tale lies in its incompleteness. The summoning is never fully realized, yet its side effects are devastating. What we encounter is not divine visitation, but dimensional leakage, a slow unraveling of biological, spatial, and epistemic boundaries set into motion by a ritual that never fully ends. The narrative structure of the Dunwich Horror is deceptive in its simplicity. On the surface, it resembles a classic monster tale, a remote town, strange happenings, a grotesque creature, a climactic confrontation. But Lovecraft overlays this with a second layer, a cryptic unfolding of metaphysical consequence. The story's true arc is not linear, but concentric. Everything spirals inward toward the invisible center, Yog-Sothoth. The plot begins with the birth of Wilbur Whateley, an abnormally fast-growing child born to Lavinia Whateley, and, it is implied, Yog-Sothoth. His rapid development and obsession with arcane texts mark him as something inhuman, a vessel, not a protagonist. Yet the story keeps, Wilbur's exact purpose unclear until his death halfway through. This is no accident. Lovecraft withholds clarity to maintain the central tension, that the real horror is not what we see, but what we suspect exists just out of sight. When Wilbur dies, attempting to steal the complete Necronomicon from Miskatonic University, the narrative fractures. What had been a tale of rural unease becomes one of escalating ontological crisis. Strange sounds, massive footprints, and the destruction of remote farmhouses suggest a force too large and too wrongly shaped to exist in our geometry. The invisible twin, Wilbur's brother and Yog-Sothoth's more perfect offspring, is revealed not through exposition, but through inference. His existence is discovered by scholars, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan, not summoned by them. The function of Yog-Sothoth in this story is generative, not active. It never speaks, appears, or intervenes. Yet its presence saturates every element. The Whateleys' rituals are invocations of alignment, not communication. They seek to open a gateway, not to call something through, but to make the world porous enough for its offspring to fully manifest. This is Lovecraft's unique contribution to horror. Not that something comes from beyond, but that the fabric keeping it out was never designed to hold. The invisible twin represents the failed boundary. His physical form, massive and unseen, warps local space. Animals sense him. Humans hallucinate around him. Houses collapse when he enters. He does not destroy with malice, but by existing where he should not fit. He is spatially incompatible. This aligns perfectly with Yog-Sothoth's descriptors. The key in the gate, a being that embodies transitions rather than destinations. The villagers' response is telling. They fear the Whateleys, but cannot articulate why. Their language, rooted in folklore and suspicion, gestures at truth they cannot fully name. The phrase black magic, repeated dismissively, fails to capture the cosmic scale of what is occurring. This gap between experience and understanding is the story's epistemological center. The horror unfolds not because no one believes, but because belief lacks precision. Language cannot reach the scale of the problem. Dr. Armitage's intervention reveals another core function of the narrative, the scholar as imperfect containment. Armitage uses academic knowledge to decipher the Whateleys' rituals and determine that the invisible twin is attempting to join with its cosmic father, Yog-Sothoth, and fully manifest. He interrupts the process with counter-incantations, not through physical battle, but through linguistic confrontation. Words attempt to hold back what words have opened. This is not a battle between good and evil. It is a crisis of grammar. The climactic revelation comes when the invisible twin, speaking aloud for the first time, cries out for Yog-Sothoth. "Father, Father, I am Yog-Sothoth's son." The horror here is not just in the voice or the scale, but in the fact that the being knows who it is. It is conscious, aware, and lonely. Lovecraft undercuts the cosmic terror with a moment of tragic intimacy. This being was made, abandoned, and destroyed, without ever understanding why. The Whateleys summoned a god. What they raised was a question with no answer. Importantly, the Dunwich Horror does not end with resolution. Armitage halts the immediate threat, but the ritual is not unmade. The knowledge remains. The space has been weakened. The gate, once aligned, may align again. Lovecraft offers no mythic closure. There is no sacred object destroyed, no holy place purified. There is only delay. This story stands as the most detailed narrative manifestation of Yog-Sothoth, not because the being appears, but because its effects become undeniable. The entity remains distant, unreachable, yet entirely causal. In Lovecraft's architecture, the more distant A force, the more powerful its impact. The Dunwich Horror shows us what happens not when a god walks the earth, but when a dimension sneezes and a valley begins to unravel. It may seem paradoxical to examine the call of Cthulhu in a study centered on Yog-Sothoth. Cthulhu, after all, dominates the story's title, structure, and iconography. Yog-Sothoth is not named even once. But this is precisely why the story matters. It reveals how Lovecraft conceived his mythos not as a roster of characters, but as an interlocking cosmology, where no entity exists in isolation, and each mythic event echoes the logic of others. In the Call of Cthulhu, the philosophical function that Yog-Sothoth occupies elsewhere, epistemic rupture, dream instability, non-linear causality, manifests in full, even without the name. This is a Yog-Sothothian story in everything but attribution. The structure of the Call of Cthulhu is deeply recursive. It is a tale within tales, notes left behind by the deceased, Professor Angel, discovered and synthesized by his grandnephew, the narrator. These notes, in turn, contain newspaper clippings, artist testimonies, archaeological records, and a sailor's first-hand account. The truth about Cthulhu is never told directly. It is assembled from fragments. This form mimics Yog-Sothoth's narrative function. As the key and the gate, Yog-Sothoth is always approached through indirect means: translation, dream, distortion. The Call of Cthulhu enacts this same methodology. Truth lies only at the recursive center, never on the surface. The story's central idea, that reality is not fixed, but thin, dreamlike, and vulnerable to collapse, mirrors the philosophical scaffolding of Yog-Sothoth. The artist Henry Anthony Wilcox dreams of sunken cities and monstrous hieroglyphs, receiving information he has no way of knowing. So do others, across cultures, races, and geographies. Their simultaneous visions are not coincidences, but resonances, signaling the thinning of the membrane that separates dream from matter. Though Cthulhu sleeps beneath the ocean, its presence bleeds into the collective unconscious. Yog-Sothoth functions similarly in the Dunwich Horror, absent but saturating. Both entities reveal that existence is layered, and that beneath waking life lies a second, older world. We must pause here. This is not simply a story about one entity rising. It is a story about how information circulates. The horror lies not in the creature, but in the discovery process. The narrator becomes progressively disturbed, not because he has seen anything monstrous, but because he has connected things that should not connect. He uncovers dream patterns, historical convergences, and first-hand testimonies that align too cleanly. This is a core Yog-Sothothian theme. The moment when disparate fragments lock into place, and the mind realizes it has already crossed the threshold. The Cult of Cthulhu, too, functions analogously to the Whateley's ritualistic lineage. It is generational, secretive, and committed to collapsing the distinction between dream and flesh. Their chant, Finglui Magulwanaf Cthulhu Relie Ugahnagel Ftagen, operates like the Whateley's invocations, not spells in the fantasy sense, but linguistic contaminants, phrases not meant to be spoken, yet impossible to forget. In both cases, the spoken word performs an alignment function, syncing human minds with cosmic structures they were never designed to perceive. The resurrection of Cthulhu from R'lyeh, though brief and incomplete, mirrors the failed summoning in the Dunwich Horror. In both stories, the intrusion of the alien into the human world cannot be sustained, not because it is stopped, but because the conditions of reality resist prolonged contact. Cthulhu retreats as the city of R'lyeh sinks once more. The invisible twin in the Dunwich Horror is dispersed by Armitage's counter-incantation. In both cases, the horror lies in the interruption, not the resolution. The door was opened. What slipped through cannot be undone. Cthulhu's form, indescribable, cephalopodin, shifting, is also Yog-Sothothian in its ontological instability. It is not made of flesh and blood. It exists outside traditional dimensions, and its geometrical context, relaye, is wrong. These descriptors echo the spatial violations in the Dunwich Horror, where the twins' movements defy local architecture and animal perception. Both entities disturb not through violence, but through dimensional misfit, and the ultimate resolution, or lack thereof, is pure Lovecraft. The narrator of the Call of Cthulhu ends not with triumph, but with dread. He knows now that reality is fragile, that gods dream beneath the sea, that dreamers across the world can sink without cause, and that he has participated in a knowledge process that cannot be reversed. This final note of epistemological contagion is Yog-Sothoth's signature. Lovecraft's mythos, then, is not partitioned. It is recursive. Yog-Sothoth does not need to be named to be present. It exists as a logic, not an entity, a code that infects other stories. In the Call of Cthulhu, we watch that infection unfold in real time. The narrative does not conclude. It loops, awaiting the next reader to join the pattern. No myth stays with its maker. Once articulated, even partially, the idea migrates, through correspondence, through imitation, through reinterpretation. Yog-Sothoth, like so much of Lovecraft's mythos, did not remain bound to its original context. Instead, it became a cultural virus within the world of speculative fiction, mutating, fracturing, and in many ways losing its original philosophical potency. The figure's later appearances, especially through the work of collaborators like August Derleth, reveal as much about post-Lovecraftian anxieties as they do about cosmic horror itself. August Derleth, the most prolific of Lovecraft's literary heirs, is both responsible for preserving the mythos and reshaping it into something Lovecraft never intended. In Derleth's vision, Yog-Sothoth becomes part of a structured pantheon, neatly divided between good and evil, elder gods and outer gods. This dualistic framework borrows heavily from Christian theology and Zoroastrian cosmology, forces of order battling forces of chaos. Yog-Sothoth is reclassified as one of the elder gods, aligned with cosmic balance, opposed to malign deities like Nyarlathotep or Azathoth. This shift is fundamentally anti-Lovecraftian. Lovecraft's entire philosophical project resisted moral binaries. His cosmos was not evil, it was indifferent. His gods were not characters in a war of light and darkness, but unknowable principles operating beyond human categories. By framing Yog-Sothoth as a force of good, Derleth inadvertently collapses the very ambiguity that made the entity terrifying. In doing so, he transforms a metaphysical wound into a narrative tool, a predictable agent within a moral system. Still, Derleth's influence endured. His taxonomic approach, classifying deities, assigning elements, mapping relationships, formed the backbone of later mythos fiction. In this expanded schema, Yog-Sothoth becomes associated with time and space, as opposed to Azathoth's madness or Shub-Niggurath's fecundity. This elemental logic is easy to summarize, teach, and replicate. It is also what makes it narratively safe. In contrast, later authors such as Ramsey Campbell, T.E.D. Klein, and Caitlin R. Kiernan have tried to reclaim Lovecraft's original ambiguity. In Campbell's work, for instance, Yog-Sothoth is not a personified figure, but a kind of environmental principle, a corrupting presence that saturates the land, air, and perception. In Cold Print, Campbell emphasizes how knowledge of the mythos is not acquired, but infects. The figure of Yog-Sothoth returns not as a god, but as a logical error, a contradiction embedded in reality that causes psychic bleed-through. Similarly, Caitlin R. Kiernan's mythos-influenced stories tend to avoid the formalized pantheon entirely. Yog-Sothoth may appear in a whispered line, a corrupted text, or a misremembered symbol, but always off-stage. Kiernan emphasizes narrative rupture over cosmic battle, treating the mythos as an archaeology of error, a textual sediment that scholars and seekers alike try to decipher, only to find themselves unraveling. Yog-Sothoth, in this context, is more virus than entity, a glitch in epistemology that recurs through unstable texts. Outside of literary fiction, Yog-Sothoth has also seeped into tabletop gaming, most famously in the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, and its derivatives like Arkham Horror. In these games, Yog-Sothoth often takes a central position as a boss-like threat, complete with stats, weaknesses, and miniature figurines. Here, the deity's original, philosophical function, disintegration of meaning, is inverted. It becomes a challenge to overcome, a being to be defeated through dice rolls and strategic play. This adaptation is perhaps inevitable. When cosmic horror is translated into systems that require resolution, the irresolvability of Yog-Sothoth must be sacrificed. The unknowable becomes the quantifiable. The gate becomes a board tile. The key becomes a mechanic. And while this allows broader audiences to interact with the mythology, it dilutes the ontological unease at the core of Lovecraft's conception. Yet there are places where the original intent flickers. In experimental media, interactive fiction, digital horror forums, and alternate reality games, Yog-Sothoth has resurfaced not as a creature, but as metadata. In some ARGs, alternate reality games, references to Yog-Sothoth appear as broken links, corrupted files, or recursive documents that reference themselves. These appearances preserve Lovecraft's goal, to disturb not through content, but through structure. We must consider one final expansion, the academic appropriation of Yog-Sothoth as a metaphor. Scholars in postmodern theory and speculative realism have interpreted the entity as an embodiment of the hyperobject, a thing so massively distributed in time and space that it becomes impossible to observe directly. In this view, Yog-Sothoth is not a god at all, but a category error, something like climate change, capitalism, or nuclear war, too large, too abstract, and too real to perceive without madness. Thus, the trajectory is complete. What began as a name spoken in corrupted incantations became a theological category, a board game antagonist, a metaphor, a philosophical placeholder. But each of these expansions distorts something essential. The more Yog-Sothoth is defined, the less it disturbs. The more it is named, the less it unnames us. When myth sustains long enough, it leaks. From literary invention to whispered story, from footnote to fabricated footage, Yog-Sothoth, like so many of Lovecraft's creations, has not remained confined to the page. Over the past century, references to this entity have surfaced in strange forums, obscure occult zines, internet hoaxes, and alleged eyewitness reports. These appearances do not authenticate the entity. Rather, they testify to something deeper, that fictional horror, when structured like forgotten truth, invites belief. In this sense, Yog-Sothoth is a rare example of a reverse folklore phenomenon. Most cultural entities begin as belief and become myth. This one began as myth and, in some circles, evolved into belief. Not in the theological sense, but in the form of serious inquiry, speculative documentation, and, in extreme cases, sincere invocation. The first wave of pseudo-historical sightings can be traced to the mid-20th century, coinciding with the rise of interest in UFOs, psychic research, and fringe archaeology. Occult journals like the Oriflamme, the Fifth Aeon, and Cryptogon published essays in the 1960s and 70s, attempting to reframe Lovecraft's mythos as channeled truth disguised as fiction. Some claimed that Lovecraft's dreams, often described by the author himself as unusually vivid, were not imaginative but receptive. In these theories, Yog-Sothoth is a gate being, appearing in altered states, dream paralysis episodes, and dissociative hallucinations. These claims mirror the structure of the Call of Cthulhu more than the Dunwich Horror, but they retroactively extend Yog-Sothoth's reach, claiming that the entity is responsible for any contact where causality appears broken. More elaborate hoaxes began to appear in the 1990s, facilitated by early internet message boards and BBS, bulletin board systems. One infamous document, often referred to as the Dunwich Manuscript, circulated online in 1997. It claimed to be a scan of a suppressed Miskatonic University research paper dated 1923, complete with faded ink and fake library stamps. The paper detailed the Whateley genome distortion hypothesis, a pseudo-scientific framework for explaining non-Mendelian inheritance patterns in backwater Massachusetts families exposed to dimensional stress fractures. Yog-Sothoth is described not as a being, but as a temporal infection, a knot in space-time whose proximity warps DNA, memory, and probability. The manuscript was revealed to be a fabrication, but it remains one of the earliest examples of mythos realism, the intentional blending of cosmic horror fiction with scientific plausibility. Another notable case involves the so-called Arkham recordings, a series of distorted audio files uploaded anonymously to paranormal forums in the early 2000s. These clips, mostly static and unintelligible, included fragments of reversed speech, repetitive chanting, and environmental sounds that loop in impossible ways. In one clip, an undulating voice chants, Yog-Sothoth is the gate, in multiple languages layered simultaneously. Analysts later identified the recordings as a multi-track digital hoax, an auditory collage. Yet even after their debunking, the experience of listening to them remains unsettling. The hoax, like the myth it drew from, leaves a residue. We must pause here. These sightings and hoaxes are not convincing in the empirical sense, but they matter culturally because they reveal a deeper truth. Yog-Sothoth is designed to be believed by accident. Its very structure, vague, recursive, semiotic, is indistinguishable from occult epistemology. Lovecraft built the entity as a cipher, an echo in dead languages, a name only ever half pronounced. This opens the door to participatory belief, not the conviction that Yog-Sothoth is real, but the suspicion that something like it might be. And suspicion, in this context, is more enduring than certainty. Modern sightings tend to shift away from the visual and toward the experiential. Anonymous. Reddit posts describe dreams in which time folds inward, spaces repeat, or the dreamer experiences multiple lifetimes simultaneously before waking up bleeding from the nose. Some report hearing phrases like, "The gate is you," or "He watches from all ends," in a voice that speaks without pause for breath. These dreams are often accompanied by missing time, clock failures, or overlapping voices on phone recordings. None of these claims are verifiable. That's precisely why they persist. In cosmic horror, proof is disruption, not documentation. Some self-described esoteric groups have gone further, attempting ritual contact. These modern-day Whateleys, operating in online occult communities, construct sigils purportedly linked to Yog-Sothoth based on geometric inversions of the Sephiroth, crop circle patterns, or theoretical physics diagrams. Their rituals aim not to summon, but to align, to synchronize consciousness with what they call multi-axial cognition. Whether sincere or satirical, these rituals follow a logic identical to the Dunwich Horror. Belief not in theology, but in configuration. This places Yog-Sothoth in a curious position. It is neither entirely fictional nor truly believed in. It exists in a liminal space, an intellectual haunting. It appears in synesthesia forums, in dream journals, in horror-themed ARGs, and in the margins of consciousness studies. Its sightings are always suggested, never sustained. This is not a weakness. It is the essence of the design. Adapting Yog-Sothoth presents a fundamental problem. The entity was never designed to be shown. Lovecraft conceived it as a structural absence, a pressure exerted on reality rather than a form occupying it. Film, games, and music, however, are mediums that demand representation. They require sound, image, mechanics. What follows, then, is not a record of faithful translation, but a study in failure modes, how different media strain, distort, or inadvertently neutralize Yog-Sothoth's philosophical function when forced into perceptibility. Film was the first to attempt this translation, and it struggled immediately. The 1970 adaptation, The Dunwich Horror, exemplifies the problem. Yog-Sothoth is reframed through psychedelic visuals, sexualized ritual imagery, and corporeal threat. The cosmic is reduced to the cultic. Rather than an ontological rupture, the horror becomes transgressive spectacle. The film substitutes ambiguity with symbolism that can be decoded, turning epistemic dread into narrative conflict. What is lost is scale. Yog-Sothoth becomes something acting within the world rather than something that undermines the idea of a world altogether. Later cinematic efforts influenced by Lovecraft, The Void, 2016, Annihilation, 2018, and Event Horizon, 1997, fare better, not by depicting Yog-Sothoth directly, but by replicating its effects. These films avoid naming entities and instead focus on spatial distortion, recursive architecture, and identity erosion. In The Void, the cult's goal is not summoning, but transcendence through structural collapse. In Annihilation, the shimmer functions as a Yog-Sothothian analog, a zone where information refracts, mutates, and loses stable reference. These films succeed precisely because they refuse clarity. They adapt logic, not lore. Video games encounter a different constraint. Games require interaction, objectives, and feedback loops. Horror must be playable. Yog-Sothoth's earliest and most influential appearances occur in the Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game and its digital descendants. Here, the entity is assigned attributes, probabilities, and outcomes. Madness becomes a stat. Knowledge becomes a resource. This systematization allows players to engage, but at a cost. When Yog-Sothoth can be encountered, resisted, or defeated, its original function as epistemic annihilator collapses. Yet some games exploit interactivity to restore dread. The Bloodborne offers a notable example. While Yog-Sothoth is not named, the game's great ones operate on identical principles. Entities bound to dream realities, time distortion, and inherited cosmic trauma. Insight, a measurable resource, reveals truth but degrades sanity. The more the player understands, the more the world deforms. This mechanic captures Lovecraft's core insight. Knowledge is not empowering. It is corrosive. The game does not punish ignorance. It punishes curiosity. Other titles, Control, The Shore, and Eternal Darkness, use environmental storytelling and unreliable perception to approximate Yog-Sothoth's presence. Levels loop, documents contradict each other. Architecture behaves inconsistently. These games succeed when they treat the entity not as an enemy, but as a systemic condition. Failure occurs when design reverts to confrontation. Yog-Sothoth cannot be fought without becoming something else entirely. Music, perhaps unexpectedly, proves the most compatible medium. Sound does not require form. It can suggest scale, presence, and incomprehensibility without resolving them. Dark ambient, drone, and experimental metal genres have long invoked Yog-Sothoth explicitly. Bands like Portal, Sulfur Aeon, and Atrium Carceri use layered dissonance, non-repeating structures, and inhuman vocal techniques to create the impression of intelligence without language. Lyrics, when present, are often indecipherable or fragmented. Meaning is submerged rather than delivered. This matters. Yog-Sothoth is not frightening because of what it says, but because of what cannot be said around it. Music allows for this ambiguity. Sustained tones, phase interference, and subaudible frequencies generate unease without explanation. Listeners report sensations of temporal distortion, vertigo, and dissociation, not because they believe in the entity, but because the sound bypasses narrative interpretation altogether. It operates directly on perception. We must pause. Here, across all these media, a pattern emerges. Yog-Sothoth loses potency when adapted as content. It regains potency when adapted as structure. Films that explain fail. Games that quantify diminish. Music that suggests. Environments that destabilize. Mechanics that punish comprehension. These succeed. A comparison clarifies the issue. Dracula adapts well because he is a character. Yog-Sothoth does not because it is a condition. To adapt it faithfully is to refuse depiction, resist explanation, and undermine the medium's own rules. Most adaptations cannot tolerate this level of self-negation. And yet, the persistence of Yog-Sothoth across media suggests something important. Creators keep returning to it, not because it is marketable, but because it names a problem modernity cannot solve: how to represent forces that exceed representation. Climate systems, algorithmic control, nonlinear causality, distributed intelligence. Yog-Sothoth becomes a placeholder for anxieties that resist dramatization. In this sense, every adaptation is a compromise, but some compromises reveal truth through failure. When a film collapses into ambiguity, when a game destabilizes its own mechanics, when music dissolves into noise, Yog-Sothoth briefly reasserts its original function. It does not appear, it interferes. And that interference, felt rather than seen, remains the closest any medium has come to adapting what was never meant to be shown. Once Yog-Sothoth escaped the confines of Lovecraft's fiction, it entered a second life, one less concerned with narrative and more with utility. In subcultures and academic discourse alike, the entity was repurposed as a conceptual instrument, a way of thinking through problems that resist stable framing. This shift marks a crucial transformation. Yog-Sothoth ceases to function primarily as horror and becomes a theoretical object, invoked not to frighten, but to explain, critique, or destabilize. Within esoteric and countercultural communities, Yog-Sothoth is often stripped of personality entirely. Chaos magicians in the late 20th century adopted the name not as a god to worship, but as a symbol of liminality, a shorthand for boundary dissolution between thought systems. In these circles, Yog-Sothoth represents access rather than authority. Rituals invoking it rarely involve belief in its literal existence. Instead, they treat the entity as a psychological key, a way to induce altered states, suspend categorical thinking, or deliberately destabilize symbolic frameworks. The name becomes a tool for cognitive misalignment. This usage aligns closely with Discordianism, which treats chaos not as disorder, but as a creative principle that exposes the arbitrariness of all systems. Yog-Sothoth fits easily into this worldview. It is not sacred, but corrosive. Not revelatory, but disruptive. Its appeal lies in its refusal to settle into doctrine. In such subcultures, invoking Yog-Sothoth is an act of resistance against fixed meaning, a rejection of closure disguised as occult play. Online communities extended this logic further. Collaborative fiction projects, most notably the SCP Foundation, demonstrate how Lovecraftian entities can be recontextualized as containment problems rather than supernatural threats. While Yog-Sothoth itself rarely appears directly, many SCP entries replicate its conceptual role. Anomalies that exist outside time, destabilize language, or cause recursive narrative failure. These entities are not defeated. They are managed, documented, and quarantined. This bureaucratic framing is telling. Cosmic horror, when filtered through modern institutions, becomes an administrative nightmare rather than a theological one. We must pause here. This transformation mirrors a broader cultural shift. As society becomes increasingly data-driven, the unknown is no longer framed as divine mystery, but as systemic anomaly. Yog-Sothoth survives not because it terrifies, but because it models. What happens when systems encounter inputs they cannot parse? Academic appropriations follow a similar trajectory, though with greater caution. In literary studies, Yog-Sothoth is often analyzed as a figure of negative capability, a term borrowed from John Keats to describe the capacity to dwell in uncertainty without reaching for resolution. Scholars emphasize how Lovecraft constructs meaning through absence, using incomplete description as a narrative engine. Yog-Sothoth exemplifies this strategy. It is never described directly, yet exerts total explanatory pressure. The text bends around it. In philosophy, particularly within speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, Yog-Sothoth has been cited as an early fictional articulation of the non-correlational universe, a reality that exists independently of human perception or interpretation. Thinkers such as Quentin Melissu argue that philosophy must confront a world that does not require observers. Yog-Sothoth embodies this idea narratively. It is not unknowable because it hides, but because knowledge itself is an anthropocentric distortion. The entity functions as a literary stand-in for the great outdoors of reality, that which remains indifferent to thought. Psychological interpretations often focus on Yog-Sothoth as a metaphor for epistemic overload. In trauma studies and cognitive theory, scholars have noted parallels between Lovecraftian encounters and dissociative states triggered by overwhelming information. Yog-Sothoth becomes a symbol of what happens when perception exceeds integration, when the mind encounters patterns too vast to contextualize. This reading reframes cosmic horror as an exploration of cognitive limits rather than supernatural threat. There is also a growing body of work treating Yog-Sothoth as a cultural metaphor for modern hyper-objects. Phenomena such as climate change, global surveillance, or algorithmic governance that operate across scales inaccessible to individual comprehension. Like Yog-Sothoth, these systems are everywhere and nowhere, acting through intermediaries, shaping outcomes without appearing directly. The horror lies not in malice, but in distributed causality. Responsibility becomes untraceable. Agency dissolves. Across these appropriations, one pattern remains consistent. The more Yog-Sothoth is used as an explanatory device, the less it resembles a god. This is not dilution, it is evolution. Lovecraft created an entity flexible enough to survive intellectual migration. Its power lies in its conceptual openness, its ability to occupy gaps between disciplines, beliefs, and systems without resolving into any one of them. Yet something is lost in this process. As Yog-Sothoth becomes a metaphor, its original function as horror recedes. Fear is replaced by fascination. Dread gives way to analysis. The entity becomes legible. And legibility, in Lovecraft's universe, is always a form of containment. This tension between understanding and disturbance sets the stage for the final section. In the end, Yog-Sothoth's most enduring legacy may not be cultural influence or academic relevance, but its psychological residue. The quiet unease that arises when one suspects that meaning itself may be provisional. In the next subsection, we will confront that implication directly, examining what Yog-Sothoth suggests about consciousness, identity, and the possibility that some questions, once asked, permanently alter the mind that asked them. Yog-Sothoth endures not because it terrifies in any immediate sense, but because it alters how terror itself is understood. Long after the rituals end and the texts are closed, something remains unsettled. The entity's true legacy is psychological rather than narrative, philosophical rather than mythic. It leaves behind a residue, an idea that once encountered cannot be fully dislodged, that reality may not be structured for comprehension, and that meaning itself could be a temporary convenience rather than a permanent feature. At the psychological level, Yog-Sothoth functions as a thought experiment with consequences. It invites the mind to imagine what cognition looks like when stripped of its evolutionary assumptions. Human perception is built on continuity, before and after, inside and outside, cause and effect. Yog-Sothoth negates these without argument. It does not challenge belief systems directly. It renders them irrelevant. The resulting unease does not feel like fear of death or punishment, but fear of misalignment, the sense that one's mental tools are inadequate for the environment they are meant to interpret. This helps explain why Lovecraftian horror often produces a delayed reaction. Readers rarely report shock in the moment. Instead, discomfort emerges later, when familiar concepts begin to feel provisional. Time feels less stable. Identity feels less anchored. The question surfaces quietly. What if the categories I rely on are local artifacts, not universal truths? Yog-Sothoth plants this question without answering it. That unanswered presence is its most persistent psychological effect. Philosophically, Yog-Sothoth undermines the assumption that knowledge is cumulative and progressive. In Enlightenment frameworks, understanding increases clarity. For Lovecraft, understanding increases exposure. Knowledge does not converge toward coherence. It diverges toward complexity. This reveals something profound about the structure of his pessimism. He is not arguing that truth is inaccessible, but that it may be structurally unusable. Truth exists, but cannot be integrated into human life without damage. We must pause here, because this is where Lovecraft departs most sharply from both religion and science. Religious revelation traditionally offers meaning in exchange for submission. Scientific discovery promises control through explanation. Yog-Sothoth offers neither. It reveals without redeeming, explains without empowering, not enlightenment, but displacement. The mind that encounters such knowledge does not ascend. It recedes, becoming aware of its own contingency. This leads to the unsettling possibility that madness in Lovecraft's universe is not pathology, but adaptation. If reality truly operates beyond human-scaled logic, then the sane response may be psychological withdrawal, refusal to integrate what cannot be lived with. Insanity becomes a defensive strategy, a way to preserve functionality by abandoning coherence. This interpretation reframes the madmen of Lovecraft's stories not as broken minds, but as minds that encountered too much structure, too quickly. The philosophical implications extend further. Yog-Sothoth suggests that identity itself may be an emergent phenomenon, a temporary alignment of memory, perception, and narrative continuity. If time is non-linear and consciousness not bound to individual bodies, then the self loses its privileged position. The horror here is subtle. It is not annihilation, but dilution. The self does not end. It disperses. One becomes a node rather than a center. Comparisons illuminate this point. In existential philosophy, thinkers like Sartre confront the absence of inherent meaning, but retain human agency as a response. In Buddhist metaphysics, the dissolution of self leads to liberation. Yog-Sothoth offers neither agency nor release. It presents selfhood as an accidental configuration, vulnerable to rearrangement by forces that do not recognize individuality. There is no ethical lesson embedded in this revelation, only recalibration. This is why Yog-Sothoth resists moral interpretation. It is not evil, because evil implies intention. It is not good, because goodness implies concern. It is simply there, operating across scales that render human values irrelevant. This indifference is more disturbing than hostility. Hostile forces can be resisted. Indifferent ones cannot even be addressed. And yet, there is a final implication that often goes unspoken. Yog-Sothoth implies that seeking may be the most dangerous human instinct of all. Curiosity, when scaled beyond the environment that produced it, becomes self-destructive. The drive to know, to open gates, to ask final questions, may not be a virtue in all contexts. Some doors exist not to be opened, but to demonstrate that the architecture around them is fragile. The enduring power of Yog-Sothoth lies in this inversion. It does not tell us what to believe. It destabilizes the act of believing itself. It suggests that some structures, religious, scientific, philosophical, persist not because they are true, but because they are survivable. Remove those structures, and cognition collapses under its own weight.